In this video, you're going to gain a method for telling the difference between inductive and deductive arguments in cases where it's not so straightforward how strongly the conclusion is claimed to follow from the premises. Hey, it's Christopher from thePhilosophicalLife.com, where we help you break down arguments so you can build up your mind. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to the channel. Click the subscribe button down below and also hit the bell icon. That way you won't miss any future videos. All right, let's jump in and get this thought party started. The primary source for today's discussion comes from the Hurley and Watson textbook, 13th edition, on logic. So I recommend you check out that book if you want to go deeper, and I'll have a link to that book as well as all books mentioned in this video in the description below. Now, there are two properties of arguments. The first property is a factual claim. So that means that at least one of the statements must claim to present evidence or reasons to believe the conclusion. Next, you have the inferential claim, which will be the focus of today, and there must be some sort of claim that the alleged evidence supports something or that it implies the conclusion, that is, that the conclusion follows from the premises. Now let's take a look at an example that's missing one of these two properties of arguments and therefore isn't an argument. So consider this following passage or statement. If Theola was born in the United States, then Theola is a U.S. citizen. What do you think? Is this missing a factual claim or an inferential claim? Answer, it's missing a factual claim. So what it's doing is it's saying, assuming that Theola was born in the United States, or under the assumption that Theola was born in the United States, then Theola is a U.S. citizen. But this in and of itself, this conditional, is not presenting evidence to believe that Theola is a U.S. citizen. It's not trying to make a statement of fact. So it's missing a factual claim. Now let's take a look at another passage. Let's see what this passage is lacking. Cabins in El Capitan Canyon were swept into the river during heavy rainfall. No injuries were reported, but 2 people had to be rescued from the high water and debris flowing down the river. Now this, as you may have guessed, lacks an inferential claim. That is, it's not claimed that one of these statements, one or more of the statements, is supporting another statement, namely the conclusion. Instead, you have just simply a description of what's going on, what happened. Explanations in and of themselves are not arguments, and you can see this little pro tip if you try to stick therefore in. Cabins in El Capitan were swept into the river during heavy rainfall. Therefore, no injuries were reported, or no injuries were reported. Therefore, cabins in El Capitan Canyon were swept into the river during heavy rainfall, or 2 people had to be rescued from the high debris and water flowing down the river. Therefore, no injuries were reported. None of that makes sense, right? So it's lacking that inferential connection. And you can often, it's not 100% guarantee, but you can often just use the word therefore or thus, a conclusion indicator, and just kind of plug it in and see if any of the statements are being claimed to be supporting one or the others. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the difference between a deductive and an inductive argument. So as it says here on the screen, in a deductive argument, the conclusion is claimed to follow from the premises by strict necessity. If a deductive argument is a good deductive argument, it's logically impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are all true. Now let's take a look at what makes an argument inductive with regard to its inferential claim. So as you can see on the screen here, in an inductive argument, the conclusion is claimed to only be probably true given the premises. This means that if an inductive argument is a good one, then were the premises all true, then the conclusion would likely or probably be true as well. To break this down a little more, let's take a look at a key question that separates inductive from deductive arguments regarding the strength of their inferential claim. So here's the question. If the premises were true, setting aside whether they're actually true or not, assuming the premises were true, would it be impossible or just unlikely that the conclusion would be false? Now, if you answer that it's impossible that the conclusion would be false given the premises were true, then the argument is deductive. If, on the other hand, it is just unlikely that the conclusion would be false were the premises true, then the argument is inductive. The conclusion follows from the premises with probability. Now let's take a look at a couple arguments and see whether they're inductive or deductive. So here's an argument about the Matterhorn. And that's not the thing at Disneyland. That's actually the Matterhorn mountain, not the creepy bear thing that kind of jumps out at you every once in a while. Anyway, I wasn't traumatized as a child there. The Matterhorn is higher than Mount Whitney, and Mount Whitney is higher than Mount Rainier. The obvious conclusion is that the Matterhorn is higher than Mount Rainier. So let's assume that it's true. The Matterhorn is higher than Mount Whitney, and let's assume Mount Whitney is higher than Mount Rainier. Well, then it just follows of necessity that the Matterhorn must be higher than Mount Rainier. So the conclusion follows from the premises by necessity. The argument is deductive. Now, in looking at an inductive argument, let's turn to our favorite sleuth, that is Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And this comes from his book, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which is linked in the description below if you want to check it out. And this is more specifically from the piece Silver Blaze. The Simpson incident had shown me that a dog was kept in the stables. And yet, though someone had been in and had fetched out a horse, they stole a horse, he had not barked enough to arouse the two lads in the loft. There were kids sleeping in the loft. Obviously, here's the conclusion, the midnight visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. Otherwise, it would have barked. Now, assuming it's true, everything he says is true, the dog, and even though somebody went in, it didn't bark, and if it would have barked, it would have aroused the lads. Assuming all that's true, well, if it makes it more likely than not that the midnight visitor was someone whom the dog knew well, and therefore it wouldn't bark upon being startled by someone stealing out a horse in the middle of the night. So, this conclusion follows from the premises with probability. The argument is inductive. Now, there are three things we can look at in order to try to parse out, is an argument inductive or deductive? Number one, we can look at special indicator words, and those are typically words that are associated with the conclusion and imply what sort of strength the conclusion is claimed to follow from given the truth of the premises. Two, we can look at just the actual strength of the inferential link between the premises and the conclusion. And then number three, the form or style of argumentation can often tip us off with regard to whether an argument's inductive or deductive regarding its inferential claim. But there's a problem. Sometimes these three factors can conflict and give conflicting interpretations of the strength of the inferential claim. For instance, the indicator words might indicate that the argument is deductive. So you might have someone say, therefore, it must be the case that blah. And given that strong word, must, that is typically a deductive indicator word that indicates the conclusion follows with necessity from the truth of the premises. But it might also be the case that when you look at the actual inferential link between the premises and conclusion, you don't actually have a deductive structure. Now, let's just quickly go through a few of the indicator words. So necessarily, certainly, definitely, absolutely, must, and tails. Those are common deductive indicators. Inductive indicators often have a probabilistic language, improbable, unlikely, implausible, or they might say things more everyday like reasonable to conclude, or it's a good bet that, or one would expect that, and so on. As I mentioned though, you have to be careful and not just get lazy and rely on only one of those factors in determining whether the argument is inductive or deductive. So let's take an example that illustrates this point. here's an argument, and we got to be careful, and here's why. Premise 1, if it's raining, then probably the streets are wet. Premise 2, it is raining. Conclusion, therefore, probably the streets are wet. Now, if you weren't thinking critically and you just sort of looked at the conclusion and said, probably, it's got to be an inductive argument, then you would have missed the fact that the form of this argument is actually deductive. So the indicator word used in the conclusion is probably and points towards an inductive argument, but given how strongly the conclusion actually follows from the premises, that is because the first premise has probably the streets are wet as its whole proposition, then when that proposition is repeated in the conclusion, probably the streets are wet, it's taken to follow with necessity. That is, the conclusion is taken to follow from necessity given the truth of the two premises. So actually, the argument is deductive instead of inductive. Now, one of the other factors are common argument forms that are associated with inductive and deductive arguments. So let me just briefly mention a few. For instance, common deductive argument forms are arguments based on mathematics. So when someone concludes from certain truths or axioms a certain conclusion, then that mathematical conclusion, it follows of necessity given the truth of the premises. An argument from definition. So if you just have an argument that relies on a definition, that's deductive, involves necessity. And then syllogisms. There are various syllogisms. That last argument was a syllogism, which has two premises and a conclusion. Common inductive argument forms include a prediction, where you're saying that given all these factors, this further thing follows, that follows probabilistically. An argument from analogy, where you're saying one thing has a certain set of features, another thing similar to it, so it must have that additional feature. A generalization, where you take a small set of things and you oftentimes are just specific things and you generalize on them. An argument from authority. And now this isn't the fallacy version. This is just an actual expert gives their opinion, and it's usually reliable. Oftentimes what they conclude or what you conclude from their work follows with probability from the premises. Argument based on signs, and then a causal inference, where you infer from a cause to an effect or from an effect to a cause. Those are common inductive argument forms. Let's take a look at the challenge. There is a challenge, though. Namely, an argument's inferential claim is an objective feature of the argument. That is, it doesn't always track the subjective intentions of the arguer. Sometimes people intend subjectively to come across a certain way and make a certain point, but in fact, the way that the argument's actually structured objectively doesn't support the language that they're using. As it says on the slide, an arguer may overstate or understate the argument's inferential claim. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at why this challenge is problematic. Well, when someone does that, it might be tempting to cast off the argument as either fallacious or just characterize it weakly in light of how they've framed things and gotten it jumbled. But good critical thinking involves good interpretation and reconstruction of arguments. It involves what's called the principle of charity. Now, the principle of charity urges us to interpret arguments in the strongest manner possible. So basically, we're giving the arguers the benefit of the doubt, and often the goal here is the pursuit of truth. So we don't want to sell the arguer short just because they got muddled. We actually want to give them the benefit of the doubt and search for the strongest possible reasonable argument within what they've given us. So the goal is to get at the truth and not to just win points or look smart. Now, Hurley and Watson provide a guide that can help you think through how to best characterize arguments in difficult cases. And this is going to help you be charitable when an arguer puts forward an argument and you're in a dialectical situation and it isn't immediately clear whether the inferential strength claim is inductive or deductive. First, what we look at are clues that the argument is deductive. So as it says here, A, arguments in which the premises provide absolute support for the conclusion, where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, they're going to always be deductive. Now, if B, arguments have a specific deductive argument form, like a categorical syllogism, then oftentimes that factor will be of equal importance to the first, and it will usually give you a clear indication that the argument's deductive. Additionally, you might look, as it says here, for arguments having a specific inductive character. And so you might look and spot and see that something's a prediction, that it's claimed to follow from a set of evidence that this further thing that is going to happen in the future is likely to happen given the truth of the evidence. And arguments of that sort are typically best interpreted as inductive. Also, you might have arguments containing inductive indicator language, which we talked about earlier, like it probably follows that. As it says there in the caveat, arguers rarely try to downplay the strength of the inferential claim of their argument. They often tend to inflate it. So if you do see inductive language in there that indicates that it's a probabilistic inferential claim, then usually you can rely on that, but not always. So again, we're thinking critically. We can't just go on autopilot. E, arguments containing deductive indicator language. So it necessarily follows that. Arguers sometimes make these sorts of claims for rhetorical purposes to try to really make their point strongly, but oftentimes that's just a rhetorical flourish and it's not doing much work. So we do have to be careful. And then finally, F, arguments in which premises provide only probable support for the conclusion. It's the least important factor, but it's one to consider. And we're going to work through some examples to see exactly how this method A through F works in parsing out whether an argument is inductive or deductive. So let's take this example. All flowers are plants. All daisies are flowers. Therefore, probably all daisies are plants. Now we just work right through the list of factors. So as you can see here, this argument is actually deductive. Assuming all flowers are plants and assuming all daisies are flowers, it follows necessarily that all daisies are plants. Now, the problem is you have that word probably in there, and we'll get to that in a minute, but first you got to note this is a syllogism. This is a classical syllogism of the Aristotelian sort. So it has a deductive argument structure, but here's that confounding factor. We do have an argument containing inductive indicator language at the bottom there. But you'll notice you have two strong factors pointing toward the argument being deductive, and then you have an additional factor that the argument is perhaps inductive in inferential strength. But all things considered, the best interpretation for this argument is deductive. Okay, now let's jump back into your favorite sleuth. Let's get back to Sherlock Holmes. It all comes back to Sherlock Holmes, and this one's from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So this is from A Scandal in Bohemia. So to set this scene up just briefly, Sherlock hadn't regularly been interacting with Watson at this point. This is when Watson had gotten married, and he came by, he just saw Sherlock's light on, and Sherlock doing his crazy, the shadow moving back and forth across the Baker Street address. So Watson thought, I'll just drop in, see how he's doing. So Sherlock sizes him up. He does his deduction. And as he says here, Sherlock to Watson, as to your practice, if a gentleman walks into my rooms smelling of idioform, with a black mark of nitrate of silver upon his forefinger and a bulge on the side of his top hat to show where he had secreted or hidden his stethoscope, I must be dull indeed if I do not pronounce him to be an active member of the medical profession. Now let's go ahead and clarify this argument by putting it in standard form so we can better see what's going on. So here we've got it. Premise 1, Watson smells of idioform. Premise 2, Watson has a black mark of nitrate of silver upon his forefinger. Premise 3, Watson has a bulge on the side of his top hat. to show where he had secreted his stethoscope. Conclusion, it must be that Watson is an active member of the medical profession. Given all these factors, we have an argument that is inductive in character. So the character of the argument, you might think, is an argument from signs. Given all these signs, all these things, they all point to this conclusion and support it probabilistically. We also have an argument containing deductive indicator language. The conclusion says it must be that Watson is an active member of the medical profession. So right now we have sort of a tie. We have two things pointing in different directions. But finally, if we think about it and we take premise 1 to premise 3, then the truth of the premises support the conclusion with probability. That is, given that he smells of idioform, has a black mark of nitrate of silver, has the bulge on the side of his hat for the stethoscope, it must be that he's an active member of the medical profession. That's a likely conclusion. Best classification is, as you might have guessed, inductive. It gets tricky because some arguments you have to figure out what's the best way of interpreting it. Is it an invalid deductive argument, or is it just an inductive argument? Now, in general, as it says here, it's charitable to take a person to have put forward an inductive argument instead of an invalid deductive argument, but that isn't always the case. And this method will help you parse out when it is the case and when it's not. So consider a typical deductive fallacy like affirming the consequent. Premise 1, Antonio Brown is happy only if he's playing football. Premise 2, Antonio Brown is playing football. Conclusion, therefore, it must be the case that Antonio Brown is happy. Now, is this best interpreted as the arguer putting forward? Remember, we're in a dialectical situation. Are they putting forward an argument that is an invalid deductive argument, or is it more charitable to interpret it as an inductive argument? Well, let's take a look and run down things. So first, we have that the argument has a specific character or form, namely, and has the form of a syllogism, which is typically a deductive argument form. Now, additionally, we have an argument that has a indicator word that's associated with deductive arguments, namely, it must be the case, which is sort of to express that the conclusion follows with necessity, assuming the truth of the premises. So far, two things pointing to deductive, and then really all we have in the end is that actually the premises only make the conclusion likely. That is, and if it is the case that Antonio Brown's happy, if he's happy, then he's playing football, and he's playing football, then it's probably the case that Antonio Brown's happy, but doesn't follow with necessity. Now, given that we have two factors pointing toward invalid deductive is the best interpretation, what do you think it winds up being? And you might have guessed the best interpretation is deductive. Now, let's flip the script a little bit. Imagine we take out of the conclusion it must be the case that Antonio Brown is happy, because we all know from recent events, he doesn't seem very happy. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look and run through our stuff now. Well, the best interpretation is inductive. I'll just let the cat out of the bag because it does have a deductive argument character or form, even though it's an invalid. And then really all we get, an additional thing, is that the premises actually provide only probabilistic support for the conclusion. Now remember, the principle of charity kicks in, and when it comes down to you're torn and you've just got two things pointing in different directions, the most charitable interpretation is to give the arguer the benefit of the doubt that they were putting forward an inductive argument, not an invalid deductive argument. I sure hope this video has been helpful in helping to sharpen your mind and get you thinking more logically, and keep living the philosophical life.